Hi, friends. It's time for more on trauma talks. And I've decided today to go over some of the manual. I've been really putting this manual together for years. And as I'm continuing to actually put it together in more of a concrete way, I think that there is so much rich information. So I'm even just going to kind of start with page 1 and give you guys little tidbits and videos to really help you understand what complex trauma is, how to work with it, and anything that's relevant to it, whether it's healing from it, understanding it, bringing in tools and skills of working with it. This is relevant to anyone who has endured complex trauma, and we'll talk today what that is, as well as family members, loved ones, significant others, friends, and or healers, therapists, or anyone working with people that have had endured especially significant complex trauma histories, so that there is an understanding, because I really am passionate that I'm seeing there's a lack of understanding and just huge invalidations that go on in our world around this. So I feel like this is really pertinent information kind of across the board, and I hope it helps for everyone out there. So I'm going to just start with page 1, and that really is, what is complex trauma? And I am kind of just looking at it here because I wanted to read from it. And this is kind of my conceptualization based on, of course, all the learnings that I've done working with clients over and over and over, from my own experiences, from research. So it really comes from all these places, but it really essentially comes from my heart too, and my intuitive space of what I have learned through my own experiences, all my clients' experiences over the many years, and friends, family, and so on. So what is complex trauma? Having complex trauma signifies that there were and may continue to be multiple ongoing or chronic woundings without resolution and necessary soothing that occurred during childhood and growing up. And they are still, the person is still affecting, or I'm sorry, the woundings are still affecting you, whether you know it consciously or not. So let's break that down a little bit, and let me go over that kind of step by step. So having complex trauma signifies that there were and may continue to be multiple ongoing or chronic woundings. So woundings would be trauma. It wounded us in some way. It was traumatic. It was an attachment deficit in a relationship, but there was some kind of wounding that happened. And in complex trauma, there's this accumulation of these woundings or this traumatic event. So it could be many, many, what we would even consider maybe small traumatic events, and that accumulation becomes huge, right? Invalidations, being ignored, just little things, and we'll go over a list of those in another talk. But what's so significant is that it happens over and over. It happens in consistency more often than maybe what is able to process through. So that's one component of it. Or it could be really, really big, huge traumas, and everything in between that, again, has happened more than once. Single event PTSD is one traumatic event, which, do not get me wrong, that can be so traumatic as well, but you can see the difference. So between complex trauma, the complexity comes in that these woundings happened over and over a period of time. and there were multiple. So it could be that it happened 2 or 3 times. It could be that it happened for years chronically. And again, those traumas could be what we would consider smaller traumas to all the way to very significant, huge traumas that we recognize and everything in between. But even regardless of what they were, it's the multiplicity that makes it so complex. So if we had chronic years of what we would say lower level traumas, it can be just as traumatizing and maybe a little differently held in our systems, but just as traumatizing as one big significant, right? And vice versa, 3 significant traumas, or for those who have endured years of these significant traumas. So you can see that there is this variation. And that is going to, again, maybe reside differently in our system. So as we explore all these things, we'll learn more and more of how that settles in our nervous systems, in our bodies, in our neurobiological aspects, the brain, the mind, in our soul, in our spirit, you know, whatever levels that this can affect all of us. So that's the first component, ongoing chronic woundings. Here's the second that's really, really key, because we can endure trauma, and if that trauma is resolved, or especially when we're in childhood, which we get to in the other part, that these are things that happen throughout childhood or growing up, adolescence. And so if the caregivers or the people around, or maybe we had like support, there can be, you know, we can move through sometimes these traumas with the right support, with soothing, right? When we're young, we can't just soothe ourselves. So what we need is caregivers or the people around us to help soothe us through these traumatic situations. And so that in itself helps build this resolution through these traumatic situations. And so without resolution and necessary soothing from the environment and from the people around us, significant, because oftentimes the worst part of trauma, and for many of my clients have expressed, the worst part is that nobody cared, that nobody did anything about it, that nobody listened, they ignored, that nobody, right? And so this wounding goes so deep when it's ignored or it's left unresolved. In fact, it not only goes really deep, it keeps accumulating. So this chronicity of multiple experiences is wounding, now another wounding, now another wounding, and they're not resolved. So you're just layering and layering. And then the older we get, we have all these layerings that are really hard to like uncouple, and we need help to do that. We can do it. This is the wonderful thing. It can take time, and we need the right support that we didn't have originally. Okay, so again, this is complex trauma in a nutshell. So then these things occurred in childhood and growing up. You could now be 50, 60, 70, in your 20s, 30s, it doesn't matter, but that accumulation that never got resolved, the soothing didn't occur. Now as adults, we didn't develop the ability to soothe and resolve these issues because they never were. And we now have this accumulation of stacked up woundings. And so we need support because we are able to do it. That's what's really neat, but we need support on how to do that. We need some information and support of how to move through and resolve and re-regulate and move through these experiences, regardless of how old we are or if we're still in it. So, and may continue. In the beginning of it was, for many people, they keep reliving traumas, whether they want to or they're aware of it or not, they continue. So now maybe they are an adult and yet they're still living in traumatic situations. And so that's something we can, work with as we're in it. or as we're out of it. And there are some differences in working if we're still in trauma situations. So whether we're a child or an adolescent and we're still in it, or we're an adult and we're in other now situations where these things are still happening, or we're continuing these patterns, whether we really mean to or not, because we don't, at the deep down, we don't mean to continue on, but they do. And we call that kind of the trauma bond, that this bonding occurs and then these patterns just ensue and they continue, even in new situations and new relationships. So then the last part of this is, and they are still affecting you whether you know it consciously or not. So some of us are very conscious how it's affecting us, or we're very conscious of certain aspects of how it affects us. And others are very unconscious, right? A lot of it comes from the unconscious. It stays in the unconscious, but every time it gets triggered, ooh, there it is. There's that pattern again. There's that symptoms. There's those behaviors, and they're there again. And so we may not know where they're coming from, or we might. And so either way, it's still in that umbrella. So possible types of wounding, and we'll go a little further in this in the next video, but let's just say here that as we go through this, we often want to note that often the most damaging part, and I said this a little bit earlier, but I want to really reiterate this, the most damaging part is that these events or situations were not honored, resolved, validated, soothed, or supported, making it more traumatic and significant and more likely to get stuck. This leaves the child or teenager at the time of the original woundings that occurred, and of course later in adulthood, unable to regulate the experiences. So they may now be an adult still in that situation, being left with significant burdens and wounding. So when we've had complex trauma, we walk around experiencing and holding in our bodies, in our minds, in our energy field, in our spirits, we hold large, huge, accumulative, because whether they were small at first, fractional, they've accumulated, they are now large burdens and wounding. So I'll leave that with it today and let that kind of sink in. I hope that this is helpful. We'll talk and we'll keep growing this. Namaste.